So let's close out this particular chapter on adapting land use and protecting public infrastructure, structures and services with a couple of more points. We looked at the land use and the planning, the criticality analysis and the recommendations made to Fiji, the Nadi township, and looking at sample targets and indicators for this action. Percentage of country slash municipalities with revised land use or urbanization plans that include current and projected hazards have to be, well understood. Share of population living in or relocated from high-risk areas, fragile buildings, or retrofitted fragile buildings. So people may think they can take an old building and make it safe and sound again, but one has to be aware of how it's being monitored and what is being done to verify risk assessment, criticality analysis, whatever you want to call it. Strategy for or specific regulations on the use of nature-based solutions approved. Areas impossible or too costly to protect against climate change impacts identified and communicated to the public. Regulations mandating the provision of climate and hazard information to buyer in real estate markets. So such regulations have to be in place. With land use, early action is more efficient. Once a neighborhood has reached a critical mass, relocating households becomes difficult. This has played out again and again in basically all crowded cities across the world, most of which are in China and India, for example, and some in South Africa, South America, Africa as well. Once high-risk areas are developed and inhabited, they may require costly protection investments, which are often unaffordable in lower-income economies. So let's say Manhattan is sitting there at sea level, and sea level is rising. Hurricanes are coming up more and more. Connecticut has built a seawall way back several decades ago. Can Manhattan really relocate, or does it have to invest in protection against rising sea levels and hurricanes? Of course, it's a rich place, so that's what it's going to try to do. But this is not an option for many poor countries, low-income countries, right? The estimated cost of the Netherlands' fifth Delta program, Netherlands, another rich country, has serious issues dealing with sea level rise because it's basically within a meter of sea level rise mostly. So Netherlands' fifth Delta program, which aims to improve national flood safety and freshwater supply, is 20 billion euros. The cost of the new flood protection system in New Orleans, a city of fewer than 1 million inhabitants, is about 15 billion. Katrina exposed New Orleans' natural and man-made problems in a very stark way, and many people that left have never come back. The reason these protection systems are so costly is partly due to having to meet rigorous design and construction standards and undergo perfect maintenance. Defense failure can lead to much larger losses than would have occurred in the absence of protection. In places with little capacity to create and enforce risk-sensitive land use and urban plans, other approaches may be mobilized, such as allocating the riskiest land to non-residential use. In many places, flood zones or wetlands can be transformed into urban parks to minimize the risk of encroachment. So you're talking about urban planning with natural-based solutions and getting people to avoid encroachments against natural defenses, for example. So here's an example. Urbanization in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, closely follows the major public transportation lines. So whatever the logic that was used to build these transportation lines, trade with neighboring countries and its own population's needs, but once you build a road, it's build it and they will come philosophy, so people will just start moving. Then the government is under pressure to provide infrastructure, schools, water, sanitation, bridges, roads, maintain them, etc. And then it's pretty much impossible to move them even if risk begins to increase from climate change, for example. So this is a critical idea for early action being more important. The other point, explore the implications of climate change for internal migrations and regional economic impacts. Not all regions or areas of a country will be affected in the same way. Some will be affected more than others, and some, such as higher elevation areas in hot countries, may gain at least a comparative advantage. So if you look at the borders of India, the northwest and the northeast are much more vulnerable to climate displacements and complicated geopolitics playing together. The Groundswell report explores this question, focusing on three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, that together represent 55% of the developing world's population. It projects that without concrete climate and development action, just over 143 million people, around 2.8% of this region's population, could be forced to move within their own countries by 2050 to escape the slow onset impacts of climate change: sea level rise, drying, wetting, extreme rainfall increase, etc. They will migrate from less viable areas with lower water availability and crop productivity, and from areas affected by rising sea level and storm surges. So you would get salinization of groundwater, or desiccations and desertification, and so on and so forth. Here is an example: areas protected to have high climate in and out of migration in East Africa in 2050. I'm always nervous about projections out to 2050, especially about demographics, but nonetheless, high certainty in high levels of climate in migration in these red blobs. So you are talking about Kigali and Bujumbura, which well-known places. Kampala, Nairobi is here, Addis Ababa is up there, Lilongwe is here, Lusaka, and on Madagascar you have the same situation. Moderate certainty in high levels of climate in migration, high certainty in high levels of climate out migrations in these black spots. So you can see that high in, high out are co-located here, nearly neighbors. Moderate certainty in high levels of climate out migrations. So these trends, alongside the emergence of hotspots of climate in and out migrations shown here, will have major implications for climate sensitive sectors and the adequacy of infrastructure and social support system. So in-country migrations may be much more much easier to deal with than cross-border migrations and climate displacements, because their ethnic tensions, language tensions, religious tensions begin to create massive problems, as happens in Syria during the war, migrating into Turkey, or Palestinians going elsewhere, and so on and so forth, right? Rohingyas coming into Bangladesh and India, for example. Okay. In particular, they may need to increase cross-regional financial support to help negatively affected regions cope with and adapt to the impacts, and reallocate infrastructure investments toward the places that are least affected and most likely to attract populations in the future. US and Europe are constantly struggling with this migration issues. It's not an easy problem. People get on boats, get out on the open ocean, and begin to drown or die from hunger and heat and so on. And then countries have to deal with that as an emergency situation, and then relocating them or assimilating them becomes just a nightmare. And these are related to climate change issues because of things that are changing, slow changes, chronic stresses and acute stresses that begin to displace people. Systematically consider nature-based solutions. Land use planning must also account for the important role ecosystems play in protecting people and livelihoods against risks. Trees on steep slopes protect rural villages from landslides when heavy rains fall. Mangroves protect coastal livelihoods during the storm surges, and forest cover helps reduce occurrence of drought. All these are obvious: ecosystem services and ecosystem-based assessment, ecosystem-based management. All these are nice words and concepts, but actually implementing them is nearly impossible. Consider strategic retreat when risk reduction is impossible or unaffordable. This is playing out in many places already, like coastal states of US, but will people move? Will developers really tell people the truth about moving away from water lines? Not really. As the impacts of climate change intensify through rising sea levels or increasingly frequent flooding or hurricane hits, authorities should consider a managed retreat or relocation of people. While some areas can afford to invest in costly physical protection infrastructure such as extensive sea dike systems, the risks involved can also make such an approach unviable or unaffordable in the long run. So very, very complicated human behavior. During cyclones you can relocate tens of thousands of people. Some will refuse to move even in the face of cyclones and hurricanes. And those who are relocated temporarily rush back to see what is left of their households, boats, land, crops, etc. Adaptation and resilience investments that are efficient over the short term can also prove costly over the long term by promoting maladaptation through the creation of new or higher risks. So if you build a seawall and sea dike system and people begin to feel falsely secure, a false sense of security, then they may invest more and more into that risky region. So this becomes essentially a maladaptation. For example, although incremental coastal protection investments may offer short-term relief, they also lock future urban economic and population growth into high-risk areas requiring multiple follow-up protection investments, which may one day become unaffordable, which is already playing out along many coasts, not only in the US but elsewhere as well. Okay, this is natural human behavior. This is what we expect in terms of risk perception and planning for the future risks and discounting future risks and thinking their kids will take care of themselves, so they will just do what is good for them, etc. So whether we wait till it's too late or whether we will begin to learn from reliable information being provided and learning by experience, learning by doing, and so on, we'll have to wait and see. Okay, it's a race against time, but we have to keep going. Alright, this chapter is over with this, and we'll come back and look at priority area 3 in the next chapter.